Pollster US 2020 is produced in cooperation with A4 Media. This episode was recorded Tuesday, October 13th. Please enjoy.
American politics has by no means lost its touch since our last show. On the contrary, it's still thrilling for Europeans like myself. Currently, the president is doubling down on his corona strategy, asking the American people not to let the coronavirus dominate them. It is a somewhat risky strategy that does not seem to resonate with the majority of voters. But like many other times, the president is not afraid to take a controversial stand. So last week, he held a rally at the White House. And on Monday, this week, the tour went on to Florida for a new rally. A state most pundits agree that the president needs to win. At the same time, Biden is active with, well, I'm not sure. All we hear about in Europe is Trump. Today's show will focus on the current state of the election, on Trump, on campaign strategies, on moderate Republicans, on the latest polls about voters in the Rust Belt and the Blue Wall, and the great sunshine state of Florida, and much, much more. This podcast is about the Battle of America. My name is Sune Steffen Hansen. I'm a partner at Rod Peterson Public Affairs Company and a former political advisor for the Social Democratic Party in Denmark. Joining me for a discussion about the U.S. election are Republican strategist from South Carolina, Chip Felgel, and Democratic strategist from Washington, D.C., Jim Arcadis, and of course, our great producer, Thomas Nørskov. Thomas, let's get the show started. Good morning, America.
Good morning.
Are you with us in Europe?
We're here.
Hello, sir.
Hi, Jim. Hi, Chip. So, guys, things kind of developed a little bit in the U.S. since our last talk. Can you please tell us where are we in the election and how is Trump doing, by the way?
Well, the president would have you believe that he has been cured by Regeneron in a cocktail, and he is out. He's out campaigning back in his rallies, as we've seen in the last couple of days. Another one, a couple more this week. That's where he's most comfortable. Met by throngs of individuals who are not apparently too worried about COVID. This, I believe, was not this isn't by design, but he's decided he's going to prove what a Superman he is and get back and tell everyone, don't worry about it. We're going to beat this thing. And so he's back on the road.
Chip, have you ever seen him at a rally?
Yeah, I have.
He's fantastic.
Well, he's a crowd pleaser. I mean, he's a showman, and he interacts very well and feeds off the energy of the crowd. And it is that's his happy place, if you will, and he's good at it.
Yeah.
Here's I think the amazing thing that's happened with Trump's diagnosis, and anybody who's watched Trump should recognize the pattern. So I was reading an article over the weekend that pointed out in a book that he wrote in 2007. It was after The Art of the Deal. It was whatever the next one was. He or The Art of the Comeback. It was after The Art of the Comeback. He gives this anecdote where he talks about how he wanted to go buy a newspaper company, but he got the flu. And because he got the flu, it meant that he couldn't go to the meeting to close the deal. And then the deal fell apart and it was a bad newspaper. And he was so lucky. And the fact that he had gotten the flu empowered him to not make this bad deal, right? This is exactly how he's trying to play getting COVID. He said this was a gift from God, right? That he literally is trying to embody the idea that does not kill me can only make me stronger.
And that plays very nicely in with the evangelical base of voters that he's trying to motivate, who believe that this is, divine intervention and that he has a better understanding of how to now fight this virus. And that plays very nicely into the narrative that he needs for his base.
Yeah.
And he's going to run with it as fast as he can.
Because he can't adopt a mindset of, I was really humbled by this thing that could have killed me, right? And gosh, we should really, any normal, rational human being would have gotten really sick. Trump, there's no short of irony involved with the fact that he received the best medical care in the world for this, in a way that the vast majority of Americans just cannot. He got healthy, receiving this experimental cocktail of drugs. He charges back out. He's telling people he wants to wear a Superman T-shirt underneath his white dress shirt so he could rip it off. This is an honest to God story in the press where he wants to rip it off and expose the fact that he's Superman. right? And that he's now telling people, his press aides are now telling people that Joe Biden doesn't have the experience of getting this virus. They're trying to turn it into a strength for him, which is not only something that, what we would expect Trump to do, but also comes as no surprise, is not the way the vast majority of the American public is looking at this virus.
No, and there's been some backlash to this. Of the 200, some of the families of the 13,000 people who have now died from COVID have been very blunt and direct in their criticism of him downplaying the seriousness of this. So there is a backlash to this behavior, but with his hardcore people, something we talked about last week, the big struggle that Trump has is that they've never really expanded their universe of voters. He's not gone out and spent 3.5 years cultivating support from people who didn't vote for him the first time, and showing he's a leader for all Americans. This only hardens that. I don't think it's a strategy that necessarily helps him tremendously well. But if it makes him feel good, his staff seems prone to let him go do it. He does have a knack for being on stage. He does have a knack for energizing and being energized by crowds. That's the P.T. Barnum in him, and he's milking it for everything he can.
Hang on for a second, guys. It's very clear to me that from a Democratic perspective, you don't like the corona strategy at all, Jim.
Well, it also plays out in the data, right? Every day that Donald Trump is defending or talking about coronavirus only highlights to the vast majority of the American people how he has mishandled it. And his handling of coronavirus in every single poll you read and all the polling averages is about 15% unfavorable, right? The net favorability is negative 15. 15% more people think that he has mishandled the coronavirus pandemic in the United States than have handled it well.
I'm going to play an interview for you later on that might balance that opinion a little bit. I'm going to play it later on, but just hang on for a second, because actually Trump has always been focusing on Republican base, Chip, and this message with the corona plays pretty well with the evangelicals. But so that's the one part, and then you have the more.
Well, you have a mix. You have the evangelicals, and you have what would be called Chamber of Commerce Republicans. Some of those people are willing, Main Street Republicans, traditional Republicans. Some of those people are willing. They do not like Trump. They do not like Trump, the person. They do not like Trump, the personality, but they like Trump's policies. And they are in some ways trying to give him a pass. They're looking for every excuse they can to then still support a guy because they're scared to death of policies that Biden may implement, particularly if they lose the Senate as well. So there's a lot of head scratching and a lot of coughing and whatever you want to call it, looking for good reasons to be. They can find economic reasons to support Trump, but they can't necessarily find presidential reasons to support Trump. The biggest argument that a lot of Americans have from an economic standpoint is that they didn't want to do what Europe did. They didn't want to shut the country down. They didn't want to close everything down completely, which proved to be a mistake if we look at other parts of the world and how they are not having reoccurrences. And yet even countries that did, such as Italy and other places, are now having some resurgence of COVID, this next wave. But as I've said before, we never got past our first wave because we never shut everything down like other countries did, to the extent that we did. From an economic standpoint only, it wasn't that. People were refusing to deal with the science because there was more of an economic concern than there was a science and a health concern.
I just want to bring it over to what we talked a little bit about the last time, that Trump actually might lose some moderate Republicans. And we weren't sure how many people, like how big that voter base might be. But Chip, you looked into it, right?
I did. I had a conversation with one of the data guys, if you will, with a group that is really actively working to do this with the Lincoln Project, Mike Madrid. And Mike said that when they began this effort 7 months ago, they really didn't feel like there was about 5% movable Republicans. But over the course of COVID and the economy and stagnation and so forth and a lot of things, they're now looking at that number being around 12% that they think are movable, persuadable. It's a high number. It varies by state to state. I thought it was very interesting that in the state of North Carolina, he said there was only about 4% there. But nationally, they believe they have uncovered at least 12% of people who identify with Republicans who are willing at least to consider not supporting Trump. Didn't say they were going to yet.
I'd be super impressed if it was that high. I mean, I'll buy your 5%, but going up to 12, I think is pretty impressive. But I guess the one thing I would say is it means different things to different people in different parts of the country. You know, the definition of being a Republican, right? Your Northeastern Republicans who are going to probably go more easily vote Biden because of social reasons, right? Like they think gay people are fine, and it's they're pro-choice, right? Versus somebody in the South, like in North Carolina, who is a traditional business Republican, is going to be a little bit more socially conservative, and that's tougher.
That's correct, which is why I think 12% is high as well. But I'm going off what he gave me, and he said that it was about 4% in North Carolina. To your point about it being a more socially conservative state.
Okay, guys. So the second part I want to talk to you about is the Supreme Court nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. She had her first hearing yesterday and a hearing today too, right? Chip, could you just tell us a little bit about this? Because you're from the state where Lindsey Graham is elected, and he's leading this, what do you call it?
Yeah, he's chairing the Senate Judiciary Committee. Therefore, he is responsible for holding the hearings on behalf of this nomination. And Graham, I think it's important not only what the Supreme Court looks like after this nomination procedure, but how this nomination is handled could in fact have an effect, and how people conduct themselves during this nomination could also affect some of these races as well, specifically Graham's. Graham is in a very tight race. At least recently, it's been tied with former state Democratic Party Chairman Jamie Harrison, who has raised a phenomenal $87 million in his race against Graham, which is just unbelievable. It's a new record. But the point is how Graham conducts himself in this hearings could affect him two ways. Number one, it could solidify his bona fides with the Trump folks in South Carolina who haven't always trusted him a lot. And at the same time, if he conducts himself with a little bit more Graham 1.0 versus the Graham 2.0 that we've seen in the last 3 years, it's an opportunity for him to make the case that he deserves re-election with some people who aren't necessarily happy with his support for Trump. So there's a lot at stake here, not only with the nomination, but particularly for somebody like Graham, who is facing a tough re-election.
My question for Tip is: are you cool with this? You know, like the way that this is being handled so close to the election. I mean, would you have been in support of filling her seat if you were in an elected position?
No, I'm personally not cool with it. I think we should follow the approach of Abraham Lincoln in 1864, where there was a vacancy 27 days out, and he waited till after the election to fill it. And the majority of Americans feel the same way. But I'm not in the U.S. Senate, and they're not. They don't care what the rest of the country thinks. No U.S. senator thinks what the country rates. They think how's this going to play for their reelection right now.
The thing that everybody should know is that this Supreme Court seat essentially represents the apex of the deal with the devil that the vast majority of the Republican Party has made. That they were going to tolerate Trump's craziness. They were going to tolerate all of the bluster and the insults and the lies and everything else if he could just deliver the judges.
That's McConnell's life goal, is to do nothing but judges. That the Senate Majority Leader has been very clear about that. And they, unfortunately, they have accused the other side. Now, the kickback from this is, well, if Barrett is pushed through and the Senate goes to the Democrats or Biden wins the presidency, that Democrats, who I think are making a big mistake, while they may be fully inclined and may fully right to at least think about it, the next thing comes about court packing and whether or not they're going to now try to balance the court out by putting new members on the court. And that, I think, is a dangerous thing for them to be talking about with a race that seems to be tightening a little bit. If they want to talk about it, great. Talk about it in January.
They're not going to talk about it. Biden's been avoiding the question on the campaign trail, and he screwed up the first couple of days when he kept saying, "I'm not going to talk about it."
Yeah, he needed a better answer on that for sure.
Yeah, well, he finally came around to the fact to point out the truth, which is that the Republicans are court packing right now. Right? They are ramming through a nomination while people are voting in the United States. I cast my ballot 3 or 4 days ago. You know. So more than 7 million people all throughout this country have already voted. That's bigger than the population of Denmark by 2 million people. To have this divisive debate going on while Americans are casting their votes is unconscionable. And Republicans did a good job for a couple of days of forcing the media narrative around this idea that maybe Joe Biden is going to expand the size of the Supreme Court and pack it with a bunch of liberals.
But could he do that? How easy is it to do that?
Technically, he can do that. There is no constitutional limit on the number of members of the Supreme Court of the United States. There's no number in there.
When was the last time it was expanded?
Well, in the 1880s, maybe. And Roosevelt tried to pack it in his first term, I believe, and he met with great opposition from both sides in terms of doing so. And then they realized he still had the authority to do it, or there was the ability to do it. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you couldn't put more people there, but he wanted to put another 18 people on there or something like that.
I'll tell you this: if Democrats win unified control of government, paybacks are a bitch, and a lot of stuff is going to change because we're going to throw out the Electoral College. They're probably going to expand the size of the Supreme Court if Amy Coney Barrett goes through. We're going to vote to make D.C. and Puerto Rico states. Republicans love talking about how, America is a center-right country. It's not a center-right country. At best, it is a centrist country, if not a little bit center-left. And the way the institutions of our democracy have been slanted against center-left voters, as highlighted particularly painfully over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, has been so egregious that the Republicans have played with fire, and they're on the verge of causing a massive blue tsunami, and they're going to be held to pay.
And that is the problem. Both parties have this problem. We should not be governing with reaction and overreaction and reaction and overreaction. So I hope that Jim is wrong in what he says there. We do disagree, and that they will not come back with this immediate reactionary thing that will only harden folks and will make it harder to get rid of Trumpism and get more traditional Republicans back into the fold if they do that.
Sure, I agree with that, but also there's a very important underlying point. There's one party that's caused a lot of these problems, and it's the Republican Party.
It would be difficult for me to disagree with you on that.
So we need someone who could actually disagree with you guys. So we're going to turn it over to the next part of the show. Thank you so much, guys, so far. We'll see you in a second.
Everything the administration has done is try to put a lid on people voting, making it sound like we can't determine our own outcomes. We can. The American people are showing up. They're voting in large numbers. It's already begun.
Everything I hear, we're winning by a lot. Then you turn on the fake news, they say, the polls are tied in Florida. I don't get it.
And quite frankly, if we win Florida, you've won.
Okay, now, guys, we have to talk about the importance of Florida. As we talked about last time, you seem to believe that there is no way in hell that President Trump can win a re-election without actually winning Florida. Why is that, Chip?
It's just critical. It's a confluence of a wide variety of voters, both up in the Panhandle, the northern part of the state, which is more conservative. You have the Latino vote in South Florida and really Middle Florida as well. There's a pretty wide diversity of vote there that carries over, and if he does well there, he'll do well elsewhere. But it's 29 electoral votes, and it's critical, but it also is a bellwether for how other segments that might be similarly identified with some of those voters in Florida, how they might vote and cast ballots around the country. But it's big. It's very big, and it's early, and they'll spend a lot of time there.
Isn't there a mathematical path to winning a re-election if he doesn't win Florida? Is there somewhere else? Like, could he break through?
I mean, there is, but Trump's chances of winning the Electoral College drop to about 5% if he does not win Florida. To put it in perspective, Florida is the third biggest prize on the map after California and Texas. And we could also have a conversation, make an argument about how Texas is in play. I would be super impressed if Joe Biden actually did carry Texas. Biden is probably up 2, 3, 4 points in Florida right now. He's got the inside track to win it. And there's another procedural angle to this too, which is that Florida can count all of its absentee or mail-in ballots earlier than most other states. So if Florida does go for Biden, there's a chance that we may know earlier than elsewhere on the map because they're counting their mail-in ballots, where it might take somewhere like Pennsylvania that does not have a long history of counting mail-in ballots, several days to finish the vote tally. But if we know early on election night that Biden has won Florida, for all intents and purposes, the election is basically over.
Because if you, with four time zones, the national news will report Florida's already gone one way or the other. That could affect late voters, although I think we do have an energized group. That could affect how people in Arizona vote. It could affect how people in California is not going to go for Trump. We know that, but it could have some effect. And it is such a diverse group of people.
Is Arizona all mail-in ballots, though?
Is it?
That's a good question. We'll have to check. So there are a couple states out west, like I think Arizona, California, Oregon, maybe, that conduct their ballots uniquely or conduct their elections uniquely by mail. I'm not sure about Arizona, but I do think that there are a lot of mail-in ballots in Arizona regardless.
In Europe, all we hear about right now is Florida, right? So, and it's kind of looked upon as a state that you obviously win the 29 people of the Electoral College. But looking into Florida, it's a lot more complex. And I actually had the liberty of, thanks to you, Chip, talking to one of your friends. He's a staunch Trump supporter. He's a campaign manager in this great state of Florida. And he knows a lot about this stuff. And I'm just going to play you an interview with him early on because he's a lot more positive towards the re-election chances for Trump than I hear from you two guys. But before going into this, and I didn't know this until a few years ago, that you actually, Florida is not just Florida. It's not like you can campaign all over and everything is up for the grabs. You have this, what do you call it, intersection 4 corridor? I-4 corridor. And it's an amazing thing that is actually that you have most of Florida is being placed by, certain areas being Republican, you can't move that. Certain places being Democratic, you can't move that. And then you have these 6 districts going from Tampa to Orlando to Dayton Beach, more or less as I picture it in my head, right? And those 6 districts actually, they're the purple area. They're the swing states sort of within Florida. If you win this, you'll win the whole state. And I read somewhere that actually during this 2016 campaign, the campaigns from Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump spent approximately $60 million just for those 6 districts in order for them to turn to one of the parties, right? And then win the whole state. So this is a very important thing that a campaign strategy needs to be focused on those 6 districts. That was a kind of a new thing for me.
Do you know what they say about Florida? That the farther north in the state of Florida you go, the further south you get. North Florida more culturally represents the American South. The further south in Florida you go, the more north you get, because it's a lot of retirees from New York who go down to Miami and that area, right? In the middle is this I-4 corridor, Interstate 4, the highway that cuts straight across the middle of the state, and that's the competitive ground, just like you were saying.
And you have a bunch of people in the casino industry, like Puerto Ricans and others that tend to vote Democratic. And then you have a lot of traditional retirees voting Republicans. And the battle is basically between which one of those groups will kind of win.
And then, very importantly, this year you have Cuban exiles and Venezuelan exiles in Miami who have been targets, I think, as we were saying last week, targets of the Trump campaign, who accuse Democrats of being socialists, like Castro, like Maduro, like Chavez, right? And so that's how the Trump people are targeting them to, vote for them.
But as I said earlier on, I interviewed Brett Doster. And Chip, can you just give us a few words about who is Brett?
Brett's a longtime political operative on the Republican side, based in Tallahassee, Florida. We have worked together in the past on a couple of races. He's very, very well versed and knowledgeable about the state of Florida's politics. And I was glad we were able to get him because I believe he can offer some good insight in terms of their strategy and how they see the state going.
Guys, let's play the interview. So, Brett, thank you so much for being part of our program and enlighten us from a Trump perspective about the election right now. Before we start, could you just tell us and the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Soon. Well, thank you for having me on the show. I think you have a extraordinary opportunity here to help people understand what's going on in America. So I started out in my political career about 25 years ago carrying bags, which is a nice way of saying I was the special assistant for a guy running for governor in Florida by the name of Jeb Bush. So this was back in 1993. He ended up winning and becoming governor in 1998, the second time that he ran. And I pretty much have been a product of the Bush campaign organization. In 2004, I had the opportunity to run George W.'s reelection campaign in Florida for the Florida aspect of that, working closely with his brother Jeb, who was governor at the time. And then shortly thereafter, I opened up my own media firm. So since then, I've had the opportunity to be involved in pretty much every presidential campaign that's come through Florida. We have a media advertising business focused on campaigns. And I was the senior advisor for the Romney campaign. And then by extrapolation, have been engaged in most gubernatorial and presidential campaigns in Florida since then.
And we're going to talk about Florida in a second, Brett. But basically, from a European perspective, so this would be the European television showing us this. Trump will lose, Biden will win. Now, we've been talking in polls that this might not actually be so true. And I know that you have a different perspective on this because you work with the Trump campaign, so you see different things that the media report. Could you just enlighten us why President Trump actually might win the election from how you see it?
Sure. Trump is somewhat of a polarizing figure, and there's a general distrust among more conservative voters anyway for pollsters. In addition to that, what people fail to realize is that even though the United States is dominated by two parties, Republican and Democrat, there are millions of voters in every state in the nation that are unaffiliated. They're independent voters. And they typically are very private with their thoughts. They don't get involved in party activism. What you saw in 2016 is that Trump galvanized independent voters because they were anti-establishment. They liked his anti-establishment views. And so they came out in droves to support the president. And I think you're seeing the same thing now. You see an intense amount of enthusiasm at the grassroots level for Trump. This does not get picked up in the national polls, which by and large are dominated anyway by partisan participants. It's also dominated, by the way, by metro area respondents. Trump does better in non-metro areas in the country. It's very much an urban versus rural type voting environment that we're in right now. So, any place that you see, any state, whether it's North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, these swing states, or what you would call target states for both sides, if Trump is within 5 points, you've got to give him at least 3 or 4. And so, we feel like he's running at either a dead even in the polls right now, or maybe leading a little bit in the polls. And we think at the end of the day that you're going to see that same surge of unaffiliated support that will come out for him.
This is very interesting, Brett, because you're basically saying there's a blind spot when it comes to the polls. Have you seen data that supports this, that you can see that actually there is a certain amount of voters that would support President Trump?
Well, we have. And what I would tell you is that some of the polling that we see watching this at various levels are things that people won't pick up on when you're doing these macro polls of the entire country. The presidential contest in Florida is still very much a state-by-state contest because of the Electoral College. So if a pollster goes out and does, say, a sample size of 800 voters nationwide, and they pick up a trend line that Biden is leading, that really doesn't tell you anything. You have to look at the state-by-state comparison. So, we're doing some races at the legislative level and the congressional level in Texas, particularly in the Dallas metro area. We're doing some work in Florida in some of the key metro areas. And in those polls, when you ask about the president's favorability rate and you ask where people are doing, how people are feeling about his job performance, Trump is performing better now in those key swing districts than he actually performed in 2016 against Hillary. He's performing better against Biden. And in addition to that, he actually is getting ratings close to or higher than 50% on his job performance. So again, in these more concentrated polls in key swing areas where there are many, many independent voters, Trump is actually performing better than 2016. I think that's a very good indication for him.
That's very interesting. And do you know anything about the blue wall? Will he be able to take that back, like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin?
It's a good question. I think that if I were Biden right now, if I were Biden's campaign, I would probably not be worried about Florida. I would not be worried about Ohio, and I would be parked in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The fact that they are not parked there right now indicates to me that they may think that they have some bigger problems in those Rust Belt states than what the national polls indicate right now. So I know that you want to talk about Florida at some point. The reality is that if Biden is able to take away Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, okay, he wins if he takes away all three of those states. If Trump keeps one of those three states, in addition to what he won last time, he, of course, will remain as president. And so, right now, if you look at the polls, again, they're very tight. They're neck and neck in those three Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And those are going to be critical for the Biden strategy.
Just before we head to Florida, I just want to ask you, which coalition of voters, because I'm not quite sure about this, which coalition of voters will bring President Trump or make him keep his position?
So I know that this sounds counterintuitive because Trump is a very wealthy man, but his largest appeal is actually with lower middle class voters, particularly lower middle class retirees. Overall, their sense is that everyone in Washington, D.C. is corrupt and that they've gotten a bad rap, whether it's on their standard of living, whether it's on frustrations that they have over the healthcare system, the banking system. They attribute many of their ills that they deal with every day to what you would call the establishment insiders in Washington. So all of Trump's rhetoric over the last 4 years, his consistent rhetoric, continuing to beat up on both the Republican and the Democrat establishment in Washington, D.C., has given him that sense of consistency with those lower income senior retirees in the country. So again, many of these are registered as independent. They're neither Republican nor Democrat. But when it comes time to make a decision between Biden, who is surrounded by the establishment, or Trump, who continues to project himself as being anti-establishment, they'll break with the anti-establishment candidate.
Thank you, Brett. Okay, so let's look now at Florida. It's a huge state. It's something we always hear about outside of the U.S. The person that wins Florida will probably become president and all this. So obviously it's a very, very important state to win. But as far as I understand, the state is pretty much divided into a blue category and red category, and then you have the I-4 corridor, which is basically where the competition is. Is that correct?
That is correct. In fact, you've accurately noted the colors, and we call the I-4 corridor purple. It's neither red nor blue. It's definitely the swing part of the state.
I assume a lot of your campaigning focus would be in this area. How do you see it moving right now? Which kind of messages from President Trump will resonate with the voters in the I-4 corridor?
So this aspect of the messaging is continuing to evolve, but you're going to see Trump over the next couple of weeks continue to make this case to voters in the I-4 corridor. And the case is over the economy. Look, Biden has really centered his campaign on coronavirus. He's centered his campaign on Trump's personality. Of course, everyone knows Trump's personality. People have intense feelings about him one way or the other. What Biden really hasn't been able to give a good answer on, that he's trying to work on now with this whole idea of being the champion for the middle class, is he hasn't been able to give people a sense of comfort that his agenda is not going to be controlled by really radical left-wingers inside the Democrat infrastructure. Trump, on the other hand, has, I think, continued to maintain that free market principles work, that he's for the middle class, that he's for keeping more money in people's pockets, so to speak, helping them keep more of their paycheck, that he's been the economic champion for the United States. But those messages will pay off. What happened with coronavirus during the shutdown is that you had big economic engines in the I-4 corridor, like Disney World, Universal Studios, the cruise industries. They all shut down. People have been out of work. The highest level of unemployment in the state has been in the I-4 corridor. Trump had a very poignant moment the other night in his first debate when he looked over at Joe Biden and said, look, this guy's going to keep you shut down for another year. I'm going to get everybody back to work. If Trump will continue to focus on that message, he will maybe not win the I-4 corridor, but he'll do well enough to win Florida. And by doing well enough to win Florida, he needs to get about 45% out of the I-4 corridor. If he does that, he should be fine.
So he basically just has to double down on this Corona strategy that he's already implemented.
That's correct. That's right.
Wow.
That's right.
Very last question here. Which voters are for President Donald Trump right now in Florida? Which voters are for Biden from your perspective? And which one are in the middle if you segmentize them?
Mm-hmm. So I would say that the very wealthy elite in the state of Florida tend to be Biden supporters. More of your middle class and working class retirees tend to be Trump supporters. And then you have your inner city urbanites, largely minorities and others who will tend to break for Joe Biden. So again, it divides very much along what I would call urban to rural and suburban communities. Rural and suburban communities being, more favorable to Trump. And then, of course, the inner city big metro areas being more favorable to Biden. And that essentially, when it comes down to election night, when you gentlemen start watching the returns coming in, pay attention to the non-urban areas of Florida. If the returns are coming in well for Trump in non-urban counties, he'll have a good night. If Biden is kind of keeping or maintaining a close proximity to Trump on election night in those rural counties, then it's going to be a good night for Joe Biden.
Brett Doster, thank you so much for bringing us into the Trump perspective from Florida. Thank you, sir.
You got it, my friend. Thank you.
All right, Chip, what is the most important takeaway here?
Well, I mean, as you can tell, I'm glad Brett was able to join you. He knows his stuff. He knows the state inside and out. I think he gave us a great overview of kind of the dynamics of the state of Florida. The one thing I think that is going to be interesting to see there with those retirees and the people that he talked about is COVID and how the reaction to COVID plays out in some of those areas as well. Florida is about, as Brett suggested, Florida really is about four different states within a state in terms of their dynamics. And so you have to run multi-pronged campaigns within Florida. You can't run the same ad in Tallahassee that you run in Miami. And then you have to have a different mix in that I-4 corridor. So there's at least 6, 7 different angles that you have to take in terms of the state of Florida. He's right. I think I would have to agree. Those rural areas, I think, are something to look at. I would definitely agree with that. I think if Biden's able to cut into those rural, middle to lower income, mostly white voters, then that would signal to me that Trump is in for a long night.
I think Florida's real tight. I said a little while ago, Biden's probably up a point or 2 or 3 in Florida. The thing that really struck me about Brett's comments was it's sort of he sort of adopted the Trump ethos that, damn the polls. We don't, the stuff we have internally shows that it's tighter than the public polls. And let me, for anybody who has any doubt, any public poll on a national level is going to tell you that Biden has somewhere between an 8 and 12 point advantage nationally. In Florida, the vast majority of polls are going to tell you that Trump has a 2 to 4 point advantage.
But Jim, isn't it basically a fair point to say this?
Well, hold on, I'm getting there. Hold on.
Yeah, okay.
The important thing is Democrats and Democratic pollsters since 2016 have been freaked out over this issue of how could we miss it? What did we get wrong in 2016? And there's been a big come to Jesus movement within the Democratic progressive research ecosystem to figure out how we can improve the polls to screen for essentially what Brett was just talking about, the hidden Trump voter. And that's doing things like making sure all the polls are weighted by education, making sure that we get the right mix of rural, suburban, and urban voters, making sure that we mix methodologies between landlines and cell phones and online polls, making sure that we put questions in there to ensure that people complete their surveys, because we found that hidden Trump voters would only complete half the poll. So they've gone through this entire this entire brain beating over the course of the last 3 or 4 years to try and get it right. And now I'm not saying the polls are perfect. I'm saying that they're very likely better than they were in 2016. And if I were a Republican, if I were Trump's guy in Florida, I would make sure that I applied the same lessons, right? I would do the same thing and say, well, why was it off, and what can we do to get it right? So the point I'm getting to is that I fail to see how the Trump pollsters have somehow out-innovated Democratic or public-leaning pollsters, publicly available pollsters, to show that the polls are as wrong as they were in 2016.
That's the basis of their strategy, is that the news is fake and the polls are fake. And they do believe that there is this hidden vote for the president, because in their minds, being for Trump has become such a anathema to some people. And so they're working on that. I think both sides got it wrong in 2016. So somebody better get it right this time, or the whole polling world is going to be on their head.
But guys, maybe it's just not that easy to measure the votes for Trump. Like in Europe, we've consistently had a problem with what we call a right-wing populist movement. The different parties representing this were often underestimated in different polls, but on election day, they did quite well. And the problem was that you actually had a situation where voters would not recognize or say out loud that they voted for those parties or those candidates, but at election day, they would actually cast a ballot for exactly those parties. So maybe there's a fair point here. You can't measure the support for Trump.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. Democratic pollsters have recognized that this was a big, big issue in 2016 and have done everything that they can to try and correct it this year, even if they've only marginally improved their methodology, right? And even if the polls are still 3-4 points off or whatever, or as Brett was saying, like up to 5, Joe Biden's still going to win the election. Even if the polls are as off as they were in 2016, there is still enough of a Joe Biden cushion in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin to carry those states. I would still much rather be in Joe Biden's position in somewhere like Florida, where the polls are showing you 3-4 points ahead, than on the other side of that.
Okay, I just want to hear, Chip, will he win Florida, President Trump?
My gut feeling says he won't, because there's so many people in Florida have been affected by COVID. These events, and he's going to go back to Florida for a couple more events. We know he will. And I think, they had that event in Sanford, Florida last night, and in about a week, we'll see how many people get COVID from being there, honestly.
Okay. I'm not going to ask you, Jim, because I know the answer already.
No. I think it's real tight. I think I would rather be in Biden's shoes than Trump's shoes, but I'm also certainly pretty worried about it, and I don't think it's a slam dunk at all. I think it's going to be tight.
Okay, so I just want to bring it back to the whole blue wall discussion thing that always fascinated me quite a lot, that Trump was able to communicate and message to the working class people, low and middle income families, and he actually broke this so-called blue wall that we talked about on the last program. After the program, Jim, you sent me an article that the New York Times just published about Biden actually doing better right now than we would expect. Could you just give a summary of that? Because it was kind of interesting, though.
So I just pulled the article up, and I think I'll read to you the main point of the entire thing. So while Mr. Trump's surprising victory in 2016 lent him an aura of political invincibility, New York Times analysis of more than 5,000 respondents to their surveys in the northern battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania suggests that Trump's winning coalition was always a fragile one. The president's margin of victory was extremely narrow, and he failed to reach 50% of the vote in each of those decisive states, and he did so against an unusually unpopular opponent, Mrs. Clinton. Now, here's the real important part. In the years after her defeat, Democrats agonized over whether their best path to the presidency was to lure back white working-class voters who defected to the president, or to increase turnout amongst Democratic voters who may have stayed home or supported minor party candidates like Green Party candidate Jill Stein. The Times analysis suggests that Biden is succeeding on both of those fronts. That is, luring back white working class voters and increasing turnout by at once peeling off a modest but crucial sliver of the president's former supporters and benefiting from a significant advantage among voters who either backed minor party candidate 4 years ago or didn't vote at all. That's it. Biden is succeeding in flipping some folks who voted for Trump, and he is succeeding at increasing turnout amongst his base, and he is succeeding in taking back those voters who voted third party in 2016. Not in such amazingly large numbers that the floor is falling out from underneath Donald Trump, but he's doing it in a statistically significant advantage that is pushing his lead in the polls steadily in those northern blue wall states.
It will be very interesting to see what happens during the next couple of weeks and if this actually comes through. We're going to put the article on our Facebook page and on the social media, and you can read it yourself there. Chip, do you have anything else to add to this?
Well, I think it's going to tighten. I think that that coalition that Jim was talking about from that article was critical to Trump. Those are disaffected voters. Those are people who felt like they didn't vote for the Republican Party. They voted for Trump. It was that personality thing going on. The question is, under Trump, has he been able to solidify that support with his policies, programs, and so forth? Those tariffs that he's enacted have hurt some of those people, and that may in fact be part of the reason that Biden's having some success there. My big thing here is the more we talk about this, the closer it gets, the closer this election comes down to. And, what I'd like is to have a I don't care. I do care who wins, but I hope that it's a clear victory for one side or the other, because I'm concerned about the reaction when the president has done such a job of suggesting that the election's rigged. And I've personally got some concerns about how supporters of either candidate are going to react when their candidate loses here.
Friends, it was amazing to have you through. We have to wrap this up. It's very late in Europe. To Republican strategist Chip Felkel, thank you so much for participating. Jim Arkadis, Democratic strategist, thank you so much for participating, guys. And what are we going to talk about next week? I think it should be the voter turnout.
Well, we're going to have, instead of debate this week, Trump has pulled out of, because, just to remind everybody, he's infected himself with COVID. We're going to have a town hall event for Joe Biden and maybe a town hall event for Donald Trump. So we'll have that to talk about, certainly. And
we will have a chance to see how the early voting is going in key states and what that means heading into November 3rd. So look forward to it.
Pollster US 2020 is made in cooperation with A4 Media. Find us on Libsyn, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or where you usually find your podcasts. If you like this podcast, please remember to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and remember to subscribe in your podcast app. Thank you for listening.